Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Matrix-12-V tutorial series. I'm going to have a look at the lag processor today. A little module, seemingly unassuming, but it really has some kick about it, this thing. It can be quite unintuitive. Hopefully we'll be able to pick that stuff apart over the course of this episode. If you're enjoying the series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to do that. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is demonstrate the most common use case for the lag processor. In fact, the vast majority of synthesizers in the past 60 years have had one. It's just been called Portamento. It's the thing that allows one note to glide up to another. That's a practical implementation of a lag processor. Now, in order to get to the Portamento settings in this synthesizer, we have to engage page 2. The VCOs have their own dedicated lag processors. This is the button that enables Portamento. It's very unfriendly, but it's actually done with this feature here. So we're going to turn lag on. A couple of changes I need to make to the synth before we start. Firstly, I'm going to set my fine tune to 0. And then I'm going to head into the voices and I'm going to put myself into unison mode. It's almost impossible to demonstrate lag processing with a polyphonic synthesizer because every voice has its own lag processor, and as you're going to see, it's already pretty complicated and we just don't need that complexity. So I'm going to lock all of the voices together so we're just dealing with a single sound. The final thing I have to do is introduce a rate. This is how fast the lag processor is going to work. I will explain what it does in a moment. I just want to get up and running first. So I'm going to introduce some rate, and now I'm going to play some notes on the keyboard. Classic Portamento effect. Now it doesn't sound like it, and there's a weird quirk about this synthesizer. At exactly the number 53, something really weird happens. At the moment, this Portamento module is actually in glissando mode. In other words, it wants to step up in discrete semitones. The thing is, the effect only kicks in at 53. So here's 52. And if I increase the rate by a single digit, suddenly, no idea what that's all about. We've got a glissando effect. In other words, it's stepping up in discrete semitones. Now, for the longest time, I couldn't figure out how to stop it doing this. I actually had to look on the Matrix-12 forum for an answer. Nowhere in the manual is this described. If you disengage the keyboard button, don't ask me why, suddenly we have a smooth Portamento. And can you hear how much slower that is at 53 than it is at 52? Really odd behaviour. Okay, so that's a quirk of the synthesizer. Let's just put it in a box and move on. Let's have a look at some of the settings in the lag processor itself. At the moment we're in linear mode, which means that the transition from one note to the next is consistent. So if I play a low note and set the rate to 53 so it's nice and slow, 2 octaves higher. So the progress up to that higher note is going to be smooth and consistent. If I take linear mode off, it's now in exponential mode, which means we'll get a logarithmic curve that describes the transition from one note to the next. You get that really fast kind of logarithmic sweep. In order to demonstrate equal time, which is what this function means, I need to turn linear back on. So you need linear on in order for equal time to work. And what this means is that regardless of how big the span is between the notes that you play, the Portamento is always going to occupy the same amount of time. It's going to take the same amount of time, which means if you've got a really big span, it'll happen. Each of the transitions will be really quick to get there in time. Let's turn it on. Now, when you engage equal time, the rate knob starts performing differently. In other words, it's much slower. I need to pull the rate down into the 40s in order to make it do anything useful. These are just weird quirks about the synth that I've discovered empirically. I can't really describe or explain any of them. So here's my low C. I'll go up 2 octaves. And back down again. And now I'll go up just 4 semitones. It took the same amount of time to get there. It was just slower in between each of the notes. I'll take that back off again. Now, the manual misdescribes legato. The way the manual would have you believe it is that this is how you get the smooth transitions, in other words, the portamento, rather than glissando effect. That's simply not true. Legato is all about how many keys you've got pressed down. So at the moment, I'll press a low C. Now I'll go up to a high C. You can hear I've got the rate set quite fast, but it's fine. And you heard the portamento take effect. That's also true if I press two notes simultaneously. So I'll hold the high note, keep it held down, play the low note, and we still get the portamento. I'm in unison last here, so every last note that I play is going to be the one that gets sounded. Now if I turn legato on, I'll do the same kind of thing. Press the low note, press the high note. No portamento at all. So we only get portamento when we're playing legato. In other words, when we play multiple keys simultaneously. That's not what the manual says. So that was an hour of my life trying to figure out why on earth I wasn't getting the effect that I wanted. Hence my dive into the forums to find out how to actually enable smooth portamento mode. I'll take legato back off again. There's one more thing I want to demonstrate before we move on with this episode, because everything that we've dealt with so far has been this internal hardwired lag setting directly connected to the VCO. There's much more to discuss, but for now there's just one more thing I want to concentrate on. I'm going to get myself centered on low C. That's 130 Hertz. Now I'm going to press a note 2 octaves higher and let it go pretty quickly. Watch the tuner. 169. The moment I repress the key, the tuner carries on from where it left off. I think it was about 184 then. 206. The lag processor has a persistent memory. This is critically important in order to understand how it works, because as we get on to the examples later in this episode, you're going to see this can have some pretty wild effects. So the lag processor remembers the last value that it was currently set to. In other words, the last modulation amount that it had applied. If you imagine this processor that's got like a persistently stored current state, it was traveling between one modulation setting and another. It takes its input from the keyboard control voltage. Every one of the keys on your keyboard has a different control voltage. That's how keyboards work. The lowest note has a control voltage approaching 0, and the highest key has basically the highest or the biggest control voltage that the synthesizer is capable of generating, whatever that number happens to be. Let's call it 127 because we're in the MIDI world. Whatever that current modulation amount is, the lag processor remembers that's its current state. And this is really the crux of the definition of what the lag processor is and what it does. And so finally, here comes the definition. The lag processor is a time-based modulation source describing a change of state. Now, okay, that's a pretty heavy definition, but that's exactly what it is. It takes this change of state that we want to apply to the synthesizer. In this case, we're playing different notes on the keyboard. And rather than jumping up to that higher note straight away, the lag processor intervenes and says, well, I hear you. I know where you ultimately want to get to, but you're not going to get there straight away. You're going to get there over a period of time specified by the rate knob. And over the course of that time, it internally remembers what its current state of that journey is, how far along that path it is. So if it's halfway up the journey from C1 to C3, it's going to think, right, well, I know that I'm currently outputting a modulation amount that in the outside world I don't really care about. It's going to translate into a C2 being played. If I can ask you to kind of grasp onto that concept with your fingernails, I'll try to show you another couple of examples that hopefully kind of clarify the situation a little bit. And at this point, we're going to abandon the keyboard's portamento effect. I'm going to set the keyboard back to normal mode, and I'm going to show the keyboard so that we can see what key I'm pressing. And I'm going to define, for today's purposes, C1 as down at the bottom of the keyboard. So if I'm talking about C2, I'm talking about here, just so that we've got some sort of common definition. Okay, so as things stand, we're back to a totally straightforward synthesizer. If I play C2, you hear a note be output at 130 Hertz. So we're going to call these pitches 130, 260 and 520, and I don't care about the rounding errors. So what other uses can the lag processor be put to? Now all of these examples today are going to be tying into VCO1 frequency because it's really easy to demonstrate this stuff with pitch. It's really easy to hear the difference in pitch, but take it as read that that is just one of any number of modulation destinations. So you could apply the same principles to the filter or the frequency modulation. Don't get hung up on the fact that we're only dealing with frequency today. That's just for the purposes of the illustration. So what I'm going to do is tie the lag processor directly to the VCO1 frequency. Now at the moment, with our modulation amount at 0, we're not having any effect. Still playing 130 on C2. Now what I'm going to do is hold C2 down and increase the modulation amount. And at its maximum, we've got an output F sharp of 185 Hertz. So we've gone up from our basic 130 up to 185 Hertz. If I come down to minus 63, we eventually settle down at an F sharp below the C at 92 Hertz. Now the reason I've done that is to demonstrate that the lag processor fundamentally is simply a modulation source. It's a control voltage that's being applied somewhere else in the synthesizer. At the moment, it's in static mode. In other words, it's got nothing to do. When I gave you that definition of the lag processor, something that describes a change of state, well, there is no change of state here. I'm pressing the same key every time. This key has a specific, I'm pressing C2, look on the keyboard. It has a set control voltage amount. That key wants to generate exactly a C2. It just so happens that the lag processor is doing something to add some extra amount, some extra frequency to that pitch so that we're hearing an F sharp. We're going to get onto the time-based effects in a moment. I really want to concentrate on the lag processor as a modulation source, a fundamental modulation source first. If we can get that settled in our heads, this is going to be a much easier demonstration. Now what I'm going to do is play a note one octave higher. I'm going to play C3. And the first thing that you'll see is that if you can catch it on the tuner, it's instantaneously going to output a pitch of about 370 Hertz. Because I've just played a note one octave higher than the last note that got played. If you play a note one octave higher, that's twice the pitch. But it's twice the pitch from this other weird starting point. Our lag processor is in the way. It's doing something extra and it's added these extra 55 Hertz onto the signal. So watch when I press the key, you'll see an instantaneous 370 Hertz and then it'll immediately start going up. So now we're at 376, 380. Let's see how high we get. And we top out at 404. It's quite nice that this tuner has a persistent state so we can see the last pitch that got played, 404 Hertz. So we can derive two pieces of information from that. Firstly, we added the extra octave onto the keyboard because we played a note a key higher, completely understood. Secondly, the lag processor did some extra work. It started from our last point at 300 and whatever it was, 70 Hertz, and then it introduced an extra amount of pitch variation, took us all the way up to 404, which is now a G sharp. If I play another note, yet another octave higher, we're going to start at 808 and we're going to go up further again. There's our 808. And this time, we're going to cap out at 882. So every time I press an octave higher, we jump that octave. That's got nothing to do with the lag processor. I'm just playing a note an octave higher. And then the lag processor is doing some extra work. So why is it adding these extra bits on every time? Well, it's because its input source is set to keyboard. Every single note on the keyboard, as I said earlier, has a different control voltage. The lowest notes have the smallest control voltages. The highest notes have the highest control voltages. And so every time I play a note one octave higher than the last, our control voltage amount has gone up by a little bit. And that extra little bit is what you're hearing the lag processor do. It takes that instruction, it says this is where you want to get, but I'm not going to let you get there straight away. I'm going to stretch that process out in time. One way that I like to think about lag processors is like a one-step envelope. If you imagine an envelope with only an attack phase, that's basically what the lag processor is doing. It's saying you're starting at 0, you're going to get to a point that's other than 0, and you're going to take an amount of time to get there. And it's the rate knob that specifies that period of time. The next example I want to give you takes us away from the keyboard, the concept of the keyboard, because those control voltages in the keyboard, they are a little bit difficult to understand. Everybody understands velocity. This is how hard you hit the key. So now I've still got the lag processor tied to the frequency, but now the lag processor doesn't care what pitch of key I play. It only cares about how hard I play that key. Now what I've done to demonstrate this is set myself up a little loop. So I'm going to play lots of the same note, all of these C's, and you can see that the notes get louder and louder. So a quick look at the settings again. Velocity is now our input to the lag processor. How hard the key gets hit is going to determine how hard the lag processor works. It's going to spend this amount of time applying modulation to the VCO frequency. All of these notes should be C. Let's see what we actually get. So you can see that lag processor saying, okay, this is the instruction you've got. This is the ultimate amount of modulation that I'm going to need to apply to the frequency. I'm not going to give it you all in one go. I'm going to stretch it out over time. The final example I'm going to give you today really introduces some complexity into that time-based factor, because we're going to tie an envelope into the lag processor. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set envelope 3 connected directly to the VCO1 frequency, and I'm going to set envelope 3 up to have a pretty slow attack and no sustain value at all. So we've got an attack phase, and then the moment the attack phase is finished, the envelope is going to drop off a cliff and have no modulation effect at all. Its sustain level is 0. Let's just hear what that sounds like directly tapped into the VCO frequency. We're not using the lag processor at all at the moment. So we start out at 130 Hertz, which is our C. And then we cap out somewhere just over 300. Let's find out what that value exactly is. 328. That was easy enough to do because we just set the maximum envelope modulation to 63, the sustain level now at its maximum, and you can see it capping out at 328. Well, I don't want that. I want it to drop down to 0. So we just learned an interesting piece of information there. The maximum modulation effect you can possibly have on the VCO1's frequency is to increase your pitch from your initial starting point of 130 Hertz up to 328, which is about an octave and a half away. So there is an absolute limit to the amount of modulation that we can apply to this oscillator. Some synthesizers have oscillator settings where you can go 5, 6, 7 octaves into absolutely insane inaudible territory. That's not the case here. There is an absolute limit, and it's 1.5 octaves in this particular case, starting from C2. Remember when we had the lag processor operating earlier, on the notes that we played, we never got more than about 7 or 8 semitones away from our bass note. That's because we hadn't travelled all the way up the keyboard. If we'd have pressed the very top note that the synthesizer was capable of generating, that would have meant that the control voltage that was being output by that particular key would have been as high as it could possibly have been. Well, we've just seen that with the envelope. With the envelope at maximum, it's about an octave and a half away from its bass note. So digression done. 1.5 octaves, and then we fall off the cliff and drop back down to 130 Hertz. Now what I'm going to do is set envelope 3 as the input to the lag processor and connect the lag processor to the VCO frequency instead. And this is where things get muddy. I'm going to turn the rate of the lag processor down to 0. Let's just hear the same effect again. There's the envelope applying. We can see that it's doing its job. The envelope is now the modulation input of the lag processor. That's being fed directly to the VCO1 oscillator. with no rate. It's basically not stretching anything over time. What happens when I introduce a rate is things get real confusing. So what just happened there? Well, this is the lag processor with its persistent state. Remember, I talked about it always remembering what its last state was. If the input to it is an ever-increasing envelope until it falls off this cliff, if I can catch the envelope halfway up its journey, then the lag processor will remember that was the last modulation input. When I press my next key, the envelope's going to be back down at 0. It doesn't care about the past. The lag processor won't be at 0. It will still be halfway through its journey. And this is where you start getting the stretching of time. We've got two time-based modulation sources here, both competing with each other for the synthesizer's attention. So I'm going to try to catch the envelope at different points. Watch the tuner. So that was about 205. The next moment I press the key, the first output you're going to see on the tuner will be 205, and it'll go down. We got down to about 145, 150, it's difficult to see, and then it started coming back up again. This is the lag processor remembering where it is. It's competing with the envelope, which is at 0. Those two things eventually meet, and they agree on where they're going to go, and then they travel off on their journey again. So we were at 160. We'll now come down from 160, getting as close to 130 as we can before we get dragged back up again. Let's take it up into the 200s. 250, okay? Again, the moment I press the next key, the lag processor knows it's at 250. The envelope knows it's at 0. Those two things will compete and you'll hear the pitch come down. Eventually, we max out. We get all the way up to 328 Hertz, which is the highest thing that we want to output. The envelope wants to output a modulation that results in 328 Hertz. And then the lag processor says, well, I'm done. I've got nothing else to do. But instead of us falling off the cliff, the lag processor stretches everything in time. It's like a shock absorber. So all of the energy that's going through it just gets diffused over time. And so you don't hear any sudden or dramatic drop-offs. I'll do it one more time. By messing around with those two time-based metrics, the attack time of the envelope and the rate of the lag processor, you can get some really interesting effects between those two. If you make the lag processor so slow that it never has an opportunity to get going before the envelope's done, remember the magical 53? Watch what happens when I press a key now. Hardly even gets off the ground. The lag processor is stretching time so slowly that by the time it's done anything, the envelope's done, back down to 0. The envelope now has no more modulation to apply. That's why I took it back down to 0. It's done. And so the lag processor goes, oh, well, shrug. I've got nothing to do. Okay, I'll go back to sleep. And the modulation tails away, and we end up back at the C that we initially played. So this thing is an absolute minefield. If you start diving into the lag processor, you can really get lost down some rabbit holes. Fundamentally, it's a relatively straightforward process. It takes two things, two changes of state that you want to apply to the synthesizer, and instead of getting there instantly, it drags them out over time and drip feeds the modulation in. But because the lag processor has an input feed that can itself take time-based modulation, the potential for chaos is pretty ripe. Okay, desperate need of a cup of tea. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.